The story of Sergeant Jonathan Lovett's abduction and mutilation is among the most gruesome and terrifying of alien encounters. The story was even disappeared from the Project Grudge files because of its horrific nature, as if it never existed. Let's explore. Hi everyone, and welcome to Project Blue Book, where we explore all things unidentified. I am Thor, and thanks for tuning in. There is a plethora of yet-to-be-investigated disappearances of human beings associated with UFO sightings. These disappearances of people in the prime of their lives, healthy and exemplary in every way, disappearing, for instance, in national parks, has been chronicled by David Paulides in his Missing 411 series. And then there are UFO sightings where people vanish, as was the case in Lucknow, India, where over 20 people disappeared in 2002 within a 10-mile radius following the sighting of strange lights in the sky and a spider-like craft seemingly connected to them in the air. Since the 1970s, the stories of cattle mutilations have topped 10,000, many analyzed by Linda Moulton Howe and published in her book A Strange Harvest, and they include healthy cattle and horses that seem to have been dropped to the ground at some height with genital area removed, rectum removed, as well as mouth, tongue, and ear. All of this was performed surgically, even if official explanations tend to lean towards the animals being victims of prey by wolves, coyotes, and other wild carnivorous hunters. The surgical precision of the incisions was intentionally ignored because they did not fit a normal explanation. Many times, additionally, the body of the animals was completely drained of blood. This brief recap is important as a prefix to the Jonathan P. Lovett story, because his is also a story of mutilation, not cattle, but human mutilation, and it has an eyewitness. And before we go further, the record of this story is now in question, as the declassified Project Grudge case file number 13 is missing from the original record. Many state because of its gruesome nature and its implications of national security around sensitive nuclear test areas. On a mid-March morning in 1956, at 3 a.m., two airmen of the U.S. Air Force, Major William Cunningham and Sergeant Jonathan Lovett, were dispatched to the fields south of White Sands, New Mexico, the famous nuclear testing range of that era, now an R&D facility. They were tasked with locating fallen debris of a missile test carried out the night before. Both were stationed at Holloman Air Force Base and reporting to the Air Force Missile Command. When they arrived on their jeep on location, they started scanning the dark wilderness with flashlights, combing a pre-designed grid assigned to them. They divided duties and continued the walk at a few hundred feet distance from each other, close enough to see each other's lights, but far enough to cover an optimum swath of territory. Lovett disappeared behind a crest line, and when Cunningham had not seen him for about 5 minutes, he started calling out his name and to return, and ultimately began retracing Lovett's steps when he heard high-pitched screams that sent chills down his spine. They were the screams of someone fighting for his life. Cunningham realized the screams had to be coming from Lovett, and he started running, thinking perhaps he got bitten by a snake or that some animal was attacking him. He came to the top of the crest to see a sight he would not forget. About 30 feet away, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw a metallic disc-shaped craft hovering only about 20 feet above ground, silent and stationary. His first reaction was confusion, because it looked like nothing he had ever seen before, and it shouldn't be there. It had no wings, no propellers, no thrust, yet it was just hovering in the air silently. But he couldn't think too much about that, because he realized something was swirling on the ground right beneath it. They were cords, a cable, extending from the craft to the ground, and they looked metallic and shiny because they reflected his flashlight. He heard Lovett scream again and now realized for the first time his sergeant was fighting the cord, laying on the ground, with one cord wrapped around his leg, holding onto him, captive, by the cable. He saw Lovett kicking and screaming for what he felt like a minute until the cable retracted into the vehicle, pulling Lovett first along the harsh surface of the high plateau desert, and then he became airborne, lifting upward. With the cord, he disappeared into the craft. He says they made eye contact moments before Lovett disappeared for good. The disc bottom closed, and the craft took off into the sky and the darkness of the night at an incredible speed and without a sound. Cunningham was left stunned in complete silence and darkness of the night. He looked around. He searched around, and there was no sign of Sergeant Jonathan Lovett. This really had happened, and we can only imagine what went through his mind as he stumbled back to his vehicle, sat down, and called it in, through the radio, that Lovett had been taken by an unknown aircraft and that it had left the scene. An airman on duty at the control tower at White Sands did identify a signature that had shown up on radar, but it moved too quickly to be traceable, he said. The area was combed immediately in the morning hours, as well as for 3 days thereafter, while Cunningham was held under questioning at the White Sands Base dispensary. On the 4th day, news came in from a search party 10 miles away from the original site of disappearance that they had found Lovett, or rather, his nude remains had been found, horribly mutilated. The condition was terrifying. Autopsy showed surgical incisions on his face, cleanly cut from the tip of his jaw to the esophagus and larynx. More shockingly, his tongue and eyes were missing, but that was not all. A part of his jawbone had been sawed off and was missing, like a clean-cut line across his teeth and jaw. And there was more. His penis was completely missing, and the area around the rectum, including the rectum itself, it had all been removed with surgical precision and skill as well, excluding the possibility of a scavenging animal or carnivore hunter being responsible, the autopsy report noted. The exact wording for the anus removal was, quote, as though with a plug extending all the way to the colon, end quote. The coroner's notes included more horrific details stating it was impossible to identify a cause of death because his blood had been completely drained away and was not found at the site of his body's discovery, and there was no trace of vascular collapse. What that means is that the blood must have been mechanically removed. The report concluded to state that the body was, otherwise, in an intact condition. Additional oddities were included in the field report from the location of the body's discovery. Several predatory birds had been found dead in the immediate vicinity, suggesting their cause of death was their attempt at eating off of the human cadaver posthumously, suggesting the body had an unexplained and not understood poisonous condition. It was not radioactive. Cunningham was arrested and charged with murder. He was charged with making up the entire story, faking the story of the craft to cover his trace, and mutilating the body himself and dumping it at a distance, all in an effort to confuse the investigation of his murderous act. Let's remember here for context, in 1956, cattle mutilation stories and their signature symptoms all present in the case, including the absence of blood, the draining of the body, as well as the surgical removal of facial, oral, rectal, and sexual organs, including the deep penetrating plug, like removal of the rectal area. This is all now common knowledge from cattle mutilation investigations, and most recently reported in Central Oregon in 2019. These facts were not understood by the investigators into the strange disappearance and mutilations of Jonathan Lovett. A military tribunal rejected the arguments, however, and Cunningham was released without charge. He left the Air Force a short time later. It's incredibly difficult to identify and corroborate this story through military records or through the FOIA because, first off, the White Sands testing range in the mid-50s was the epicenter of US nuclear weapons development. Therefore, it was highly secretive. Anyone there would have had a Q clearance, which means they would have undergone thorough psych evaluation as well as being sworn into secrecy and loyalty. Project Grudge investigated this case. It got the number 13, but in the Freedom of Information Act release of Project Blue Book records, Project Grudge Report 13 is missing. So what's the corroborating evidence? Author of Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials claims in his book to have independent sources confirming the existence of Project Grudge Report number 13. A second independent source, Milton William Cooper, often labeled conspiracy theorist, he stated on a 1991 Colorado radio program that, quote, "Our Army division have been compromised as a result of these mysterious deaths." And listen to this. A case from New Mexico in 1956 demonstrates how quickly someone can be kidnapped. End quote. This was years before the most reliable source, former Green Berets Bill English, attested to having been assigned the task of analyzing Project Grudge Report number 13, and that he spent days studying it. To this day, the 600-page report, number 13, remains missing. And I doubt the Grudge reports jump from 12 to 14 just for superstitious reasons. You can watch and listen to this and other podcasts on Project Blue Book, where we explore all things unidentified. Each day, let's practice compassion and kindness. And please subscribe. I am Thor, and thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
In the mid-1950s, two families in rural Kentucky made headlines across the country when they told police that their home had been approached by small metallic creatures that could not be killed or scared away. The media coverage of the incident helped draw attention to neglected reports of UFO landings and entity encounters, and the strange goblin-like creatures excited the public imagination. At the same time, however, hostile and sensationalized reporting on the incident served to discredit stories of contact with anomalous entities, and helped erect the veil of ridicule that now surrounds them. In the fall of 1955, 50-year-old Glennie Langford lived in a simple farmhouse about 12 kilometers north of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, in the small hamlet of Kelly. She owned a small farm about 400 meters from each of her nearest neighbors, and lived with her son from her first marriage, J.C. Sutton, who ran the farm, and his wife Aileen, as well as her 3 children from her second marriage, Lonnie, Charlton, and Mary. They kept a few pigs, a dog, and some farm cats. The family had no radio, phone, or TV, and their only water came from a well in the backyard. On the evening of August 21, 1955, Mrs. Langford had a number of guests staying at the house. Elmer Sutton, the eldest son from her first marriage, and his wife, Vera, as well as Elmer's friend Billy Ray Taylor, and his wife, June. Aileen's brother, O.P. Baker, was also staying the night, for a total of 11 people. Mrs. Langford allowed no liquor in the house, and no one was drinking. Around 7 p.m., Billy Ray went out to the well for a drink of water, and saw a bright, silvery, saucer-shaped object gliding silently through the air. It flew 9 to 12 meters off the ground, and left behind it a trail of multicolored exhaust. The object flew in from the south, and stopped over the neighbor's field to the north of the farm. It then descended straight to the ground, and appeared to settle into a gully some 90 meters from the house, though Billy Ray could not see it land through the trees. He ran inside and told the others that he'd seen a flying saucer, but everyone told him it was just a meteor. Within an hour of the sighting, the dog began barking violently, and Billy Ray and Elmer went out the back door to investigate. The dog ran under the house with its tail between its legs, and the men noticed an eerie glow approaching from the field. As it came nearer, they could make out the figure of a small creature, about a meter tall, with a large, round head resting directly on its shoulders, and long arms that reached almost to the ground. It had huge hands with talons on its fingers, and large floppy ears. Its eyes pointed 45 degrees out from center, and emitted a yellow light. Its upper body was muscular, but its legs were thin and spindly, and had no knees. The entire creature was silver in color, and gave off an eerie glow in the darkness. The creature walked slowly to the house with its arms raised to the sky, so Elmer grabbed his 20-gauge single-barrel shotgun, and Billy Ray grabbed a .22. They moved inside the back door and shot it when it came within 6 meters of the house. The men claimed that the creature did a backward somersault, then fell to all fours and ran back into the weeds around the yard. Billy Ray went back inside with Elmer, who gave his gun to JC and grabbed the 12-gauge shotgun. Billy Ray and JC then shot a creature peering in through the window, which also flipped backwards and ran away. The men went out the front door to see if they'd killed the thing, but as Billy Ray walked out past the overhanging roof, a clawed hand reached down and touched his hair. Aileen pulled Billy Ray back inside, and Elmer ran out and shot the creature on the roof. Billy Ray then noticed a second creature on a branch of a maple tree in the yard, and the men shot it. They said the creature didn't fall, but floated to the ground, so they shot it again, and it scurried off into the weeds. At the same time, another creature appeared from the northwest. Elmer shot it at almost point-blank range, and said that it sounded like shooting a metal bucket. Later, the men shot another creature on the roof. When they hit it, the creature floated 12 meters across the yard and landed on the back fence, then scurried away when they shot it again. The men gave up on trying to kill the things, but for the next 3 hours, the creatures repeatedly approached the house, climbed over the roof, and peered in through the windows. The witnesses noticed that the creatures only approached in the cover of darkness, and did not step into the glow cast from the yard lights. They had 2 distinct forms of locomotion. When approaching the house, they walked slowly with an upright posture. After being shot, however, they dropped to all fours and ran away by propelling themselves with their arms rather than their legs. The being seemed to give off more of a glow when shot, and even when simply shouted at. There were never more than 2 of them seen at once. By about 11 o'clock, the group was becoming hysterical, so they piled into the 2 vehicles on the premise and drove to the Hopkinsville police station. The officers on duty remarked that everyone looked to be in shock. The officers immediately called the chief of police, Russell Greenwell, then notified the Kentucky State Police. Greenwell, 2 state troopers, and all the witnesses but June Taylor, who was particularly shaken, drove to the scene. The Christian County Sheriff's Office also sent a deputy sheriff, and called the staff photographer at the Kentucky New Era, the local newspaper, who arrived with his wife. 4 military police from Fort Campbell, a reporter from Madisonville, and 1 or 2 curious locals also arrived. On the way to the farmhouse, one of the state police said that he heard a whining sound like artillery fire and saw 2 streaks of light flying downwards to the farm. Later, the officer claimed that these were only meteors. Several other locals said that they'd seen meteors as well, at different times. The small army of witnesses, reporters, police, and investigators converged on the farmhouse and flooded the scene with light. The witnesses remained outside while Greenwell led the investigators in a search of the house, yard, and some of the surrounding fields. Though they saw the evidence of a firefight, they found no evidence of the creatures. However, Greenwell and others found a small patch of grass by the back fence that was luminous at a certain viewing angle, which was later suggested to be a type of bioluminescent fungus. Greenwell, who had his own UFO sighting in 1952, believed that the witnesses had seen something strange, but he had no proof of anything. Investigators began to leave once it became clear that there was nothing left of the creatures, and by about 2 a.m., the exhausted witnesses were finally free to sleep. Around 2:30, Mrs. Langford was lying on her bed with her head towards the window when she noticed a light from outside. When she opened her eyes, she saw one of the creatures peering in, with its claws on the screen. She notified Elmer, who shot it in spite of her protestations. More shots were fired in the next 2 hours, but the creatures were not deterred. They showed no hostility whatsoever, and never once attempted to enter the house, only to look inside. They were last seen just before dawn, around 5 a.m. Later that morning, investigators returned for a more extensive search of the grounds, and the story hit the news. It was first reported by the local radio station, WHOP, in their early morning broadcast, and their news reporter interviewed the witnesses later that day. Bud Ledwith, the engineer and announcer, arrived the same day with the station owner's son. He spoke with Langford and the Sutton women, and drew a sketch of the creatures based on their descriptions, documenting the witnesses' earliest recollections. Ledwith later did 2 more sketches based on the men's suggested corrections. Over the next few days, newspaper and radio reporters poured into Hopkinsville from Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. An officer from Campbell Air Force Base arrived on the scene after hearing WHOP's coverage, though the Public Information Office denied that there had been an official investigation. Greenwell also claimed that 2 men arrived from Standiford, a commercial airfield. Despite the attention, the family declined most interviews, as did most of the neighbors. Some neighbors, however, claimed to hear gunshots, and another saw lights on the farm shortly after Taylor's sighting. Investigators found nothing, not even a footprint of the little creatures, but other forms of evidence went undocumented. For example, there was no effort to collect the bullet casings littering the house and yard. On the second day after the incident, Project Blue Book, the UFO research group of the US government, put out a press release claiming that there was no basis to the story, no official Air Force report, and no investigation underway. It is now listed in the Blue Book files as unidentified. Still, the media coverage created a buzz and drew sightseers from the area. People drove into Kelly in such numbers that parked cars lined the roads for nearly half a kilometer on either side of the property, and crowds of visitors surrounded the house for days. Entrepreneurs wanted to set up merchandising booths in the front yard, but Mrs. Langford turned down every offer and never appeared on TV or radio after the WHOP interview. She put out a plea in the Kentucky New Era begging people not to visit, and she repeatedly called the state police to clear away the sightseers. Much of the reporting was inaccurate and often hostile, especially in the national press. Reporters referred to the unknown entities as little men, and exaggerated their number and intent. A few papers said that there were 12 to 15 of the things, and most described the event as an invasion, despite the creature's non-violent nature. Out of state, papers referred to the creatures as little green men, a term used in Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast, even though no one had described the beings as green. Despite the flippant coverage from governments and journalists, the case received at least one thorough investigation. In June of 1956, Isabel Davis, an investigator with civilian saucer intelligence, spent 4 days in Hopkinsville, with a follow-up 10 months later. She spoke with Glennie and Aileen, the only two cooperative witnesses, as well as Ledwith, the neighbors, a few reporters, and the 3 police departments on the case. Davis also later obtained all Air Force documents on the Kelly landing case, which showed that the commander of the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, home of Blue Book, requested information on the incident in 1957 after learning of Davis's upcoming report. The reply confirmed that a reserve officer had visited the scene, but made it clear that the higher-ups didn't believe in saucer landings. Hynek, however, who worked with Ledwith on another project, and read Davis's manuscript, took a personal interest in the case and discussed it in the UFO experience. Davis produced the definitive report on the Kelly Hopkinsville incident in Close Encounter at Kelly, which was published by the Center for UFO Studies in 1978. The case has no easy explanation. Most UFO sightings end up being explained as misidentified natural phenomena, such as planets and meteors, but it's impossible to account for the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins with any natural causes. It is extremely difficult to believe how any person, object, or animal could have been seen and shot at so many times, and for so long a period, and still be mistaken for a shiny floating goblin. Still, the debunker Joe Nickel has suggested that the creatures were merely great horned owls defending their territory. How these owls survived multiple gunshots is left unexplained. Others have suggested that the event was a hoax. Many investigators found Billy Ray Taylor to be an unreliable witness, and accused him of either exaggerating his story or of hoaxing the event outright. Other witnesses, however, showed no signs of exaggeration or of attempting to capitalize on the encounter. Langford in particular was considered to be an unimpeachable witness by all investigators. Even if Billy Ray, or some of the others, had invented their parts of the story, it seems unlikely that all of the participants went in on the hoax together and kept up the ruse for the rest of their lives. After all, they gained nothing from it. A few days after the encounter, the Suttons put up a sign in their driveway demanding an admission fee, with additional fees for pictures and interviews. The papers took this as a sign that the whole story had been hoaxed for profit, but only Billy Ray was seen to have collected payments. Everyone else just wanted to get rid of the visitors. If the families contrived the story to make themselves rich and famous, then they almost completely failed to capitalize on an ideal situation. At the same time, there is also no physical evidence to verify the eyewitness accounts, not even claw marks on the ground or the house's corrugated iron roof. Still, the ground was dry and hard, and even the investigators left no prints on the scene. What's more, the witnesses showed clear signs of shock and terror. One of the medically trained investigators who rode to the farmhouse with Billy Ray measured his heartbeat at 140 beats per minute, twice the normal average. All but one of the 11 family members saw the silver creatures for themselves. Investigators found no signs that the witnesses were intoxicated in any way, and had ruled out drug-induced hallucinations. Whether they were physically real or not, the little goblin creatures left their mark in popular culture, as did the people who saw them. The entities inspired a number of movie and video game monsters, including the monsters in Critters and Gremlins, the Pokemon Sableye, and the farm invasion scenario in the popular Nintendo 64 game Majora's Mask. reporters' use of the term little green men caused a revival in its popularity, and forever associated it with cases of alien contact. Kelly now hosts an annual Little Green Men festival that embraces the stereotypical image of the green-skinned alien, though it pays homage to the encounter. The witnesses themselves, and especially Billy Ray, the most imaginative reteller, lived on as the basis for the stereotypical UFO witness. A southern, gun-toting country boy with a meager education and a wild imagination. Despite the negative spin, the case helped to bring reports of entity encounters into the mainstream media, and compelled the US Air Force to acknowledge them. People everywhere had reported seeing unknown entities since the summer of 1947, and there was a wave of entity sightings across Western Europe in 1954, but the US Air Force had a policy of dismissing them categorically. As more witnesses came forward with their own stories after the publicity over the Kelly incident, these cases became harder to ignore. Whatever happened that night, it's clear that the witnesses felt it was something wholly unusual. Hounded by tourists, and afraid of the being's return, Langford sold the home within a few months of the incident, and everyone did their best to move on. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter became an instant classic in UFO lore. The strange goblin creatures have inspired a number of pop culture monsters, and the families that saw them became the basis of the modern stereotypical UFO witness. Anyone who thinks that only gun-toting hillbillies see UFOs and aliens owes a lot of their bias to the media's coverage of the events at Kelly, Kentucky in 1955.
A majority of the time when people see a UFO, there is a prosaic explanation. In the rare times when something truly anomalous occurs, the experience is usually witnessed by a few people, with little to no corroborating evidence, and these people would have a difficult time convincing others of their experience. Even rarer are anomalous experiences that occur amongst multiple people within the military, in which the anomalies were tracked or observed with technology not available to average citizens, and with military testimonies that add a level of credibility to the occurrence. Between 1977 and 1978, the region surrounding Colares, Brazil, experienced a wave of strange UFO sightings that were witnessed by hundreds of people, to the point where the Brazilian military was called out to investigate, with some assistance from the United States. The military investigators would also have their own anomalous experiences with these UFOs and record them in official military documents. The events surrounding the Colares UFO flap are quite remarkable, given the number of civilian and military witnesses, and the fact that there are hundreds of pages of documentation and photographs surrounding the events, many of which were declassified for public consumption. As fascinating as this case is, given all of the corroborating sources, it is also quite disturbing. The UFOs in Colares were not just simply observed flying at a distance, they tormented people. Multiple people would be injured by these UFOs, seemingly on purpose, and a few would die as a result of these UFOs. So, let's look into the events surrounding Colares.
As part of this program, we looked at some cases that were really good from Brazil, 77, 78. It was like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. 1,000 pages of documents, all done by the Brazilian Air Force investigative team. 500 photographs, 15 hours of motion film. A lot of medical injuries.
We were quoted as saying people have died from, it was, I don't know which you were referencing at that time.
Colares, Brazil.
Tá? E ficou conhecido na época como chupa-chupa. Mas a Força Aérea precisava saber o que estava realmente acontecendo. O que era isso?
OVNIs é o editor da revista Ufo, Ademar Gevaer. Ele mostra as conclusões de um projeto secreto conduzido pela aeronáutica em 77 na Amazônia e batizado com o sugestivo nome de Operação Prato.
anti-Goulart demonstrations that greeted the now deposed Brazilian president at Miami Airport when he was en route to take office in 1961 show the deep distrust that has finally led to his downfall and exile in Uruguay. Troops had to be called out in Brasilia to quell the bitter protests of thousands against the notoriously left-leaning João Goulart's taking office. A Russian trade show in Rio de Janeiro gave President Goulart, who paradoxically is a millionaire rancher, a chance to hobnob with some of his Soviet heroes. But it was his sympathies with nearer-at-hand Fidel Castro that the Brazilians really feared. Riotings against Goulart were frequent, yet when the end of his regime came, it was through a brief and bloodless military coup. What his successors can do with the almost totally wrecked economy he leaves behind him is a matter of concern to the entire Western Hemisphere.
In March of 1964, a coup was carried out in Brazil to oust the left-leaning president, João Goulart, by members of the Brazilian armed forces that would put the country under the rule of a military dictatorship for 2 decades. This coup was supported by the United States and the CIA. Just offshore of Brazil during the coup was the USS Forrestal, in case U.S. troops were needed to help maintain order during the transitional period. This coup was another chess move in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States feared that Brazil would become another China or Cuba under their new president. Following the coup, the U.S. would continue their support of this new government, supplying them with financial and military aid, despite the dictatorship's brutality and record of political kidnappings. I bring this up to help paint the picture of what the political climate of Brazil was during the Colares flap, and to emphasize that the United States maintained a degree of control over Brazil, given the nature of the Cold War and the economic and military support the United States was providing. Far away from the politics of the big cities like Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo was the small fishing community of Colares, Brazil, situated near the mouth of the Amazon in the northern Brazilian state of Pará. This small town had roughly 2,000 inhabitants. The city had one church, one priest, one school, one physician, and was about 60 miles away from the nearest large city of Belém. A majority of the local economy in Colares was related to fishing, which was the most common occupation of the townsfolk. The people of Colares enjoyed a peaceful, tranquil life, and nothing newsworthy ever really happened there. That would change when the UFOs began appearing in August of 1977. Initially, the first reported sightings of UFOs in Colares were from fishermen returning to shore after work. They reported seeing luminescent orbs flying towards the shore from the sea. These orbs were multiple different colors, ranging from red, orange, yellow, blue, and green. Other UFOs that were reported were more mechanical in nature, and some UFOs people didn't even know how to classify because they were so strange. They were reported flying erratically in ways not possible from planes or helicopters. A 44-year-old fisherman named Manuel João de Oliveira Filho would say of one of his early encounters that he saw what looked like an umbrella-shaped object hovering 13 feet off of the ground. It then shot a vivid white light into the ground and moved away silently. A carpenter named João Dias Costa and a fisherman named João de Cruz Silva reported seeing luminous spheres that would fly and occasionally swoop down close to the ground. A resident named Sebastião Wernick Miranda was quoted as saying, "I was there with my wife, Palmira, in front of the church on the seafront, when at about 8 p.m. we saw an intensely vivid orangish light coming from the sea towards the town. As it approached, it climbed and then moving rapidly, vanished towards the inner part of the island. At first these UFOs seemed odd, but harmless, and the townsfolk were intrigued. But soon, the UFOs would take on a different nature. Pretty soon these UFOs began to focus their attention on the residents of Colares, and began harming them on the streets and even in their homes. Some of the common things these UFOs allegedly began doing to people was stunning them, leaving them paralyzed, shooting light beam rays at them that hurt and burnt the victims. Some reported being pricked and feeling like something was inserted into them. And lastly, some reported that it felt like these UFOs were sucking their blood. This earned them the nickname Chupa Chupa, which translates to suck suck in Portuguese. Some victim accounts are as follows. 49-year-old resident barber Carlos Cardoza de Paula reported, "Everybody else was asleep. I was just still having my last smoke when suddenly a ball of fire entered our house and up near the ridgepole. It started shooting around and around the room and then finally came right close to my hammock. It ran up my right leg as far as the knee without touching my skin. I watched with much curiosity as it then moved across to the other leg. Then I started to feel feeble and sleepy. My cigarette fell from my hand and I came to and let out a yell. The fireball quickly vanished and everybody woke up. I think it had been searching for a vein in my body but didn't manage to do so. As its brightness grew, I felt a sort of heat coming from it. 44-year-old farmer Manuel Matos de Souza would say, "I was sleeping. It was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, on Tuesday, when through the gaps in the shack wall over the door I saw that rays of bright light penetrated with great intensity. I got up, and opening the door, I saw a strange object standing 5 meters more or less from me. Inside, a couple laughing out loud as if they were making fun. Even chained by the red rays that reached me, I quickly went into the house picking up my shotgun. I pointed towards the ship, pulled the trigger, but to my surprise, the gun did not fire. At this point, the right side of my body started to go numb. That was when I screamed for my wife and my children, with panic in the house. Meanwhile, the device disappeared without making a noise, disappearing into the sky." Aurora Fernandez, 18 years old at the time, stated that she was attacked in her home at night by a cold, strong wind and felt a terrible fear as if she were being enveloped by a strange force. She said, "I was terrified. I called my mother, who was already asleep like the rest of my family in the house, but before my mom arrived, a strong red light surrounded me and left me paralyzed. At the same time, I felt very fine punctures in my breast. Then I fell to the ground and passed out." Her mother reported seeing a colorless liquid that smelled like ether oozing from her puncture wounds. The city of Colares had only one physician, Dr. Valelde Cecim Carvalho. She initially thought that the town was experiencing a mass hysteria when her office began to be overrun with people claiming injuries from UFOs. She was perplexed at the real injuries she would observe in the patients coming in. She took blood samples and concluded that the victims suffered from generalized hypothermia, chronic headaches, burnings, intense heat, nausea, tremors in the body, giddiness, and often presented small orifices in the skin where they were hit by the rays. She wrote, all of them had suffered lesions to the face or the thoracic area. The lesions, looking like radiation injuries, began with intense reddening of the skin in the affected area. Later, the hair would fall out and the skin would turn black. There was no pain, only a slight warmth. One also noticed small puncture marks in the skin. The victims were men and women of varying ages. Though she couldn't explain the real-world injuries, she still remained skeptical of the UFO stories until eventually she had her own encounter. On her way home from the clinic one afternoon, she saw a ship that she described as cylindrical in shape, hovering about 100 feet above her. The ship began to make erratic movements and then disappeared in an instant. This encounter confirmed to her the unfortunate reality that these UFOs people were reporting were real. Dr. Valelde stated that after 60 days of daily occurrences and 120 cases, she started to produce reports for the Brazilian Executive Health Secretariat, or CESPA. However, as reported to the Pada newspaper, she was prohibited by CESPA from admitting that something strange was happening. Many people continued to come to her clinic with injuries, and eventually 2 women would die. One woman, after being attacked by the lights, was immediately sent to the larger hospital in Belém, as she was in a critical state upon arrival. 5 days later, another patient arrived completely rigid, or unable to move, in the back seat of a squad car. The patient's legs were hanging out of the car door because she could not bend them. Her whole body was still, and she gasped for air, but she did not have a fever, and did not vomit. The very inflexible woman was in a dire state medically, and Dr. Carvalho sent her to the city hospital. Dr. Carvalho received the medical papers and the certificates of death from the Medical Institute legal director, Renato Chavez, which stated both women had died of a stroke. After months of increasing frequency of encounters and the increasing intensity of harm, the residents of Colares were soon in a panic. Ana Celia Oliveira, now a school teacher, was 6 years old at the time of these events. She would say, "People and animals were attacked. There was no food. Terrible lack of food. No one was fishing. People would not go out of their vegetable gardens for crops. Everybody tried to go around in large groups. Nobody wanted to be left alone. All of Colares stopped. At 6 o'clock it got dark and we would go to sleep. Groups of as many as 50 to 60 women and children would get together in one house. The men would stay awake all night." The objects began to be seen around the greater Para area. People saw several strange objects of varying dimensions, including cases involving sightings of unidentified underwater objects, entering or exiting the waters along the coast. Several cases arose, according to several witnesses, where the UFOs made ceilings, walls of houses, vehicles, and other solid objects invisible. Often, the power would go out in the entire town when a UFO would fly nearby. Another disturbing aspect of these UFOs is that over time they seem to be interested in women more than men, with 3/4 of those attacked being female, mostly younger. Many were terrified to go fishing, and thus the town began to go hungry. Eventually, many of the women and children fled the city. The men would light bonfires in an attempt to scare off the UFOs. The local priest, Father Alfredo de la O, would also have his own encounter and began to patrol the streets while armed with the locals. They reported that when they would shoot their weapons at the UFOs, their guns suddenly would not work. With encounters like these occurring in other parts of the state of Para as well, soon the local newspapers began covering these events. Dr. Carvalho and local officials got together in town and pleaded with the mayor to reach out to the military for help regarding the attacking UFOs. The mayor of Colares, Alfredo Bastos Filho, would say, "Yes, indeed I can tell you, there isn't a moment of peace. The people are terrified by that Chupa Chupa affair. I even managed to see one of the injured victims myself, Dona Mirota, a lady who was receiving medical treatment at the health clinic." In October, the mayor of the nearby city, Vigia, would have his own encounter as well. The Belém newspaper, Provincia do Para, reported that at 6:45 in the evening of October 18, 1977, Vigia Mayor José Soyero was at home talking to his wife when he heard shouts in the streets about a strange object crossing the sky at great speed and giving off yellow light. He ran to a window in time to catch a glimpse as it passed over an island east of the town, going toward the nearby village of San Antonio do Ubintava. Vigia itself had plunged into darkness a few minutes earlier, as the electricity failed, and the people were alarmed. After the object disappeared, it reappeared 2 minutes later, moving toward Vigia, and then rapidly disappeared again. As Mayor Soyero stood in the streets watching with his wife, his mother, his grandmother, his 12-year-old son, a city councilman, and other townspeople, another object arose from the Colares area, 15 miles to the southwest, and moved towards Vigia. Police Commissioner Benjamin Amim said that the following evening, 6 unidentified flying objects were seen over the village emitting rays of green, red, and yellow lights. Eloy Santos, a city councilor of the town arena, would say, "It is no longer possible to deny that Belém is, today, a frightened city. We are not technicians, nor do we discuss the conclusion of the authorities. We are only surprised by the statements of witnesses who see lights crossing their roofs to penetrate their skins, removing some blood and leaving the epidermis with visible needle marks and burns." Eventually, after months of terror, the mayors of Colares and the surrounding cities reached out to the Brazilian military for assistance.
a golden colour.
No, orange.
Is there red lights or something?
They said they were flashing red lights. I think this is a bit imaginative colour. I don't think you could see that there. Saw a door. They didn't all put the... That's the...
I think that one's upside down.
Is it? That's interesting because the child has caught the flashing of the lights, you see. Oh, very interesting. A lot of them saw the figures.
Virtually in line with our overhead electric cable.
Okay.
Yes, you see, because, well, investigators, how right we are, I don't know. But know that, now what's that?
I think he's trying to lock it or something. Propulsion. Maybe something he's more familiar with. I don't know if
But they look, but Barry Downey said like rugby balls, which they are, because they're that way. Well, that's a nice drawing. Got artistic talents, yes. I'm not sure whether it's more difficult. This to me was the impression. But I spoke to John Spencer last night, and John Spencer told me that they have a very interesting case in England where the actual creatures were at a great distance away,
Right.
but the children saw them close to. So there's a time discrepancy. But this, I would say, you wouldn't be able to see.
As I said to Tim yesterday, I mean, I do believe the children saw something. I personally wasn't out there. But my only main concern is the fact that their imaginations might have been carried away.
Yes, but even then...
But I do feel that they did actually physically see something, yes, that we couldn't explain what it was.
You see, the head will know the children better than anybody else, and they're the ones who have a very vivid imagination. In 1979, I did with Hilary Evans. A lot of the top British people were involved in Wales, and the children had the same sort of thing. I saw the headmaster of the local school. They had it in the newspapers, and everybody laughed. But when I went down 3 times and spoke to the children, one of the things that their class teacher said was that sooner or later the children come out and say, we didn't really. And these kids are now 19, 20 years old. And she said, never denied what they saw. So, it's very exciting because we could, they said, could be the biggest story in the world.
Really?
I think Tim Leach said that.
Just come and sit on these chairs along here, please. I think that'll make life easier. Just make them all straight line, I think. Yeah, please. You want to?
No, I just wondered because he was the one that spoke to me.
Alright, these are the grade 7s, the oldest children here at the school who say they saw something.
Did you all see something?
Yes.
Can you just tell me very briefly, if we go along, just say what your name is and what you saw?
Nathaniel Coxall.
What did you see?
There was sort of like ship landed on the ground.
Why do you say ship? Did it have a shape?
Yes.
Like what?
It had a round top and it was flat around the sides.
What was around the side?
Just sort of like a platform coming around the side.
Did you see anything else?
Yes, we saw a black man running around.
A little man or what?
From where we looked, he was about this small, but we were quite way away. So he was about our size.
Could you see his face?
No.
What is your name?
My name's Luke Nell, and I didn't see the spaceship, but I saw the little black guy. He was all black, and it looked like he had long hair.
Could you see his face?
No.
Just in a black What was he wearing?
It just looked like he had long hair, and he was all black.
But he wasn't naked.
No.
What did he have on?
No, that's all you can see.
Oh, you can only see that?
Yeah.
Why? Was he among the trees?
It's just about like a shadow. It just showed a shadow came.
What is your name?
Triple one.
Oh, and you also saw this
Yes, we were all there.
creature?
Yes.
What did you think it was?
I don't know, really.
Did you see the thing, whatever it was, land?
Yes, after the bell rang, I was walking up to the class, and I just saw flashes in the side of my eye, and that's really what I also...
But you didn't see anything on the ground?
No, I saw it, just the
shadow?
Yes.
What's your name?
I'm Daniel Mandy, and I saw this silver thing in amongst this clump of trees with this one thing sitting on the side and another thing sort of like running up and down the top.
When you say thing, was it a form of some sort?
Yeah, it almost looked like a real person, except it was fairly plump.
No, not really. And what did you think it was? What were your thoughts?
At first I thought it was just some boy from the compound playing around, but the hair was. It looked more like our hair. It wasn't curly. That thing almost looked like a hippie.
Like a hippie. And your name?
My name is Emily Bolton. I saw the little black men. They had longish hair, and it was all black, and they had big black eyes. That's all I saw. I saw a glimpse. They kind of turned around and stared, and then went back into a kind of like ship. There was like sort of one big one with quite a few little ones all scattered around.
When you say it had big eyes, show me with your hands the size compared to
They
yours.
were oval, kind of like that.
Oval?
Yes.
I see. And could you see anything else on the face?
No, I couldn't. All as I could see was his hair, and when he turned around, and then he...
Were you afraid?
Yes, I was.
What did you think it was?
Well, everybody was saying that they were UFOs and everything, so...
Other people said they were UFOs?
Yeah, people were coming around telling... we were in the classroom and I ran out and I saw it. I did think they were UFOs. I did see them.
Were you perhaps influenced by what the other children had said?
Sort of, but I did definitely see...
What you saw?
What I saw, yes.
You also see?
Yes.
What is your name?
Charity Shanda.
What did you see?
I saw something silver on the ground amongst the trees and a person in black. And that's all I saw.
You saw a person alongside the silver thing?
Yes.
What did the silver thing look like?
It looked like a saucer, but the shape wasn't really round.
Have you heard about UFOs before this?
No.
You didn't know anything about it, so it was something quite new to you?
Yes.
Were you afraid?
Yes.
What did you do? Did you run to fetch the teachers, or you just stayed with the other children?
I stayed with the other children.
Okay, thank you.
No, unfortunately not. We were actually having a staff meeting at this particular point in time. So, to my knowledge, there wasn't any of the adults.
On July 26, 1952, U.S. government officials and high-ranking military personnel gathered in the radar room of Washington National Airport. They were tracking an inbound craft traveling at more than 7,000 miles per hour, zeroing in on the nation's capital. Now, for the first time on television, one of the men in that room has come forward to tell sightings the craft they were tracking was out of this world.
When this string of UFOs appeared over Mexico in 1992,
UFO researchers took the threat very seriously. The UFOs bear an uncanny resemblance to these objects, filmed over Utah 40 years earlier. But this was 1952, and UFOs were more likely to inspire B-movies than serious research.
Never before has the screen reached such heights of excitement.
In 1952, a double feature cost 25 cents, and UFOs were science fiction. And so it wasn't surprising that very few people took the threat seriously when flying saucers showed up in the nation's capital. It was the end of the trail for an unprecedented wave of UFO sightings, in which more than 1,500 people had reported seeing the strange craft.
1952 was a major turning point in the history of UFOs for the main reason that this was the year that so many UFOs were seen by military interceptor pilots and tracked on radar.
Richard Hall believes that the Flap of 52 was among the most significant events in UFO history.
When these sightings happened, we were in the midst of the Cold War, which involved a fear that the Soviet Union was going to send bombers over and there would be an atomic war. And this was the period when we had bomb shelters and air raid drills, and kids at school had to go hide under their desks. And so the immediate reaction was, well, this must be a Soviet Union enterprise. It must be a breakthrough in technology.
The United States Air Force launched a top-secret investigation as part of the year-old Project Blue Book.
Air Technology Center in Dayton, Ohio was put on a high-priority project to check this out, and they very quickly learned that this was not anything the Soviet Union had produced. And this led a lot of people immediately to say, well, if it's not from the Soviet Union, it must be from outer space, because there was no other explanation for it.
The Foreign Technology Division at Wright Field, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was swamped with calls from alarmed eyewitnesses. Veteran newspaper reporter Al Chop was hired by the Air Force to manage the flow of information.
The policy at that time was to answer to the best of our ability any queries on particular UFO sightings, and often we could explain what the people saw, often we could not.
Chop estimates that at least 25% of the UFOs investigated by the Air Force were verifiable, but unidentifiable, including this Montana sighting and the sighting in Utah. In each case, eyewitnesses described multiple bluish-white objects flying in formation at speeds beyond the reach of 1952 technology. The government was interested, but not alarmed by these sightings until two Midsummer's Night Saturdays, when they showed up in Washington, D.C.
We have UFO sightings that take place at the Washington National Airport on 2 consecutive Saturday nights. Objects are seen on radar. They're seen visually, not only at Washington National Airport, but Andrews Air Force Base. Everybody who was there saw something.
Kevin Randall has one of the largest collections of data, documents, and photographs about the Washington incident.
What is interesting is that we have radars in separate locations also seeing the objects. We have airline pilots seeing them as well. Air Force interceptors are scrambled. They see the objects as well. So we have a wide variety of people seeing these bright bluish-white lights.
In 1952, National Airport was Washington's only airport, centrally located and within a few miles of 3 important intelligence centers: the Pentagon, the White House, and the Capitol. Al Chop was in the airport radar room the night the UFOs first appeared.
We let the press in, and they were observing the scope along with the radar operators. We had about 4 or 5 radar operators there.
The Air Force ordered an immediate scramble at nearby Bolling Air Force Base, but the interceptor jets weren't there. They were in Delaware.
The Air Defense Squadron that normally guards the Capitol was assigned to Newcastle, Delaware, because they were repairing the runways at Bolling Air Force Base, which seemed unusual for UFOs to visit the Capitol when the jets aren't there.
It took over an hour for 2 F-94s to reach the Capitol.
Well, we could see the flight coming in. All of our unknowns disappeared completely from the scope. It was kind of scary, so we let them go back to base. It seemed like the very second that the interceptors left the range of our scope, our UFOs came back.
The fighters were recalled and began searching the skies over Washington. One pilot did make visual contact with the UFOs, and this time, the objects did not disappear.
He flew into this cluster of lights, and then he said, "I see them, they're all around me." and he described them as brilliant blue-white lights. And we just looked at each other, couldn't figure out what was going on up there.
The objects hovered in the sky until dawn, then disappeared. There were banner headlines in newspapers across the country, recounting the spectacular flyover and speculating about its origin. On July 29, 1952, Major General John A. Samford, Air Force Chief of Intelligence, held this press conference to explain the government's position.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion.
It was the most heavily attended news conference since World War II. That's how big it was. And they were under pressure to explain what is this thing that's flying all over the country that we can't identify and have no control over. The official conclusion the Air Force came to was that temperature inversions had caused these sightings. Temperature inversions are when a cool layer of air gets trapped over a warm layer and forms a sort of atmospheric lens, and the signals are refracted and you see things flying around where there really is nothing.
According to Hall, temperature inversions give only very weak radar returns and are incapable of the kind of acrobatic performance clearly observed on radar at National Airport.
And the Air Force came up with the rather lame explanation that they were temperature inversions. This, for some reason, satisfied people. It's hard to imagine why, but it did. It threw people off the track, and newsmen, like everybody else, I guess, it was too mind-boggling for them to believe it was real.
But the incident is indelibly set in the minds of those who experienced it firsthand.
These were good, solid returns. The Air Force radar expert who was present that night stated that they were good, solid returns, and he thought they were picking up metallic objects.
These solid returns for metal objects have never been identified, friend or foe, earthly or extraterrestrial. From Utah in 1952 to the so-called attack on Washington to Mexico City in 1992, these objects remain a tantalizing mystery, begging to be solved. But so far, no government has been willing to claim the obsolete 40-year-old technology as its own, or to provide another explanation, or even to pledge the funds necessary to conduct a comprehensive investigation. Our leaders do not see UFOs as a potential threat, and in that way, little has changed since 1952. By assuming the Washington flap of 52 was created by unusual weather conditions, some ufologists believe the U.S. government missed a golden opportunity to make significant contact with extraterrestrial visitors. They wonder, will we be ready the next time other worldly forces choose to make their presence known?
Outside the nearby B-52 hangars, Sergeants Eichner and Jones are oblivious to the latest security breach.
Jones, you want to get me to 3/8?
Sure thing. Coming up.
Sergeant Eichner and Sergeant Jones are B-52 mechanics. They're doing their work on the base.
Hey, Eichner, get out here. You're gonna want to check this out.
What is it?
I don't know.
Eichner and Jones, now the fifth and sixth witness in the strange sighting, follow the light as it once again circles the base.
Control tower to base commander. The object is back, sir, near the hangars. Sir, it looks like it may have landed.
The object leads Eichner and Jones to an off-limit restricted area.
You sure about this?
They think, well, maybe we ought to get out of here because we're not supposed to be in this specific area.
Suddenly, they see the object directly in front of them.
Eichner and Jones hear the security police and decide to exit the restricted area as quickly as possible. But right now, the last thing on Lewis's mind is Eichner and Jones.
The lights go out, the object disappears again.
It appears to be heading north, sir. Now it's left our airspace, sir.
The object heads back again towards the northeast, towards the Canadian border. And disappears off radar, very similar to what happened the night before. The MPs continue to search the base to make sure no one has physically landed on the base. This is the one case where the United States government admitted that some unknown aircraft penetrated U.S. nuclear facilities, and they were not able to determine either where they came from or whose aircraft they were.
I looked out the window and observed this light moving at a very excessive speed, in excess of 600 knots, coming at the helicopter. It looked like a locked-on missile.
A family of 5 in a car observed the strange red object on a collision course with Colonel Coyne's helicopter. They pulled off the road to watch.
The thing that makes this particular evening a unique experience was that it was almost a mid-air collision with an object that we, or you know, as a UFO. We did not know it was such until it was on top of the helicopter, and that took just a matter of minutes.
Colonel Coyne put the helicopter into a dive to try to avoid impact. When he and his crew looked up, the object was keeping pace with them.
While it was in this position, the green light came out from the undercarriage of the UFO.
Colonel Coyne cut the power and set the controls for a steep dive. In spite of this, the helicopter was pulled upward toward the UFO from an altitude of 1,700 feet to an altitude of above 3,700 feet. Colonel Coyne and his crew observed the strange UFO at close range for approximately 2 minutes.
The object that I viewed that particular evening had a high degree of technology. It was composed of a structure and a design that we do not have. The object can move through the atmosphere without causing any turbulence. It can move at high speeds below 10,000 feet. There are no vertical or horizontal stabilizers, no landing gear, no source of propulsion reflected on the craft. Looks like it could fly in space.
This is Major Coyne, Army helicopter pilot. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Arrigo Jetsi, Air Medic Sergeant Healy, and Robert Janicek. These men had just finished their annual flight physical early that day and were found fit and sound of mind. They would take off from Port Columbus Airport about 10:30 p.m. But what was about to follow, and the subsequent report they filed, would put to the test the credibility of these men.
Approximately 8 miles east of Mansfield, our crew chief, Sergeant Robert Janicek, observed a red light on the east horizon.
Did you gentlemen see the same red light?
Yes, I did. Our helicopter was flying on a northerly heading. We were flying at an altitude of 2,500 feet. He indicated that the light seemed to be pacing the helicopter, moving along in a parallel direction with our aircraft.
Which direction from the helicopter was it at?
Moving, it was to our right, to the right side of the helicopter, and it was moving with us as we were heading north towards Cleveland. And at this time, he indicated that the light changed its direction and was coming directly at the helicopter, at the same altitude. And as the helicopter was maintaining a speed of 90 knots, the object came at a terrific speed from the horizon. We estimated 15 miles. Visibility was reported 15 miles that night.
Did you gentlemen see the object at this time, after it had been pointed out by the sergeant?
No, not at that time. I was flying left seat or co-pilot, and visibility from that seat from an object approaching from the right is rather limited. So I was having a difficulty seeing the object. And it was for that reason that Major Coyne did take the aircraft or the controls from me.
I grabbed the controls from Lieutenant Jetsey because I thought it was going to hit us. I braced for impact. With that, I pushed the collective down to get the helicopter to start to descend. I then looked at the altimeter. It was showing 1,700 feet, and we were descending 1,000 feet a minute. The helicopter began to descend, and as this object came at the helicopter, it seemed to descend with the helicopter. When the helicopter went down, the object came down, but it still came directly at our broadside, as if to hit the helicopter from the right side.
Did anyone else see the object at this time?
Yes, I was watching it come out of the east horizon, and the only thing I felt was when the skipper took over the controls and we started to auto-rotate down, and I'd never been involved in a mid-air collision, so I was just watching this thing come at us. It was at this time a light swung 90 degrees from the UFO towards the helicopter, and it came in through the front of the plexiglass, and the entire cabin inside turned green from the light. It was a pyramid-shaped type light that beamed down and came through the front of the helicopter.
How long was your aircraft bathed in this beam?
The light that came into the cockpit apparently lasted only for a few seconds, but it was enough time that I observed the red instrument panel lights utilized for night flying to be absorbed by the green light.
Was it possible for you to determine the outline of this object against the star background?
Yes, sir. It was a cigar-shaped object, like a symmetrical airfoil with the dome on it. It was a solid object. It was a metallic structure to it. And you could see lights reflecting off the structure, and you could not see any of the stars or behind the object itself.
Well, while all this was going on, what was the attitude of the helicopter?
Apparently, when we were supposed to be descending at 2,000 feet a minute at 100 knots, we were climbing at 1,000 feet a minute with the controls still established for a descent. And we went from 1,700 feet up to 3,500 feet and topped out at 3,800 feet. I would like to stress one important fact, and that is there is approximately 20 years of Army aviation experience between the 4 men on board the helicopter that night. We have been trained to follow procedures and regulations in reporting incidents, regardless of how they're accepted. And we try to follow those procedures. And we reported the incident as it occurred and have avoided any speculation on the subject.
For centuries, mankind has pondered the question, are we the only intelligent beings in the universe? Among the billions of stars out there, might there be other forms of life, perhaps far more advanced than us? This question remains a mystery, but regular reports of UFOs, unidentified flying objects, which appear from time to time in places all over the world, add fuel to the debate. One of the most famous UFO incidents of all time took place in the skies above Marlborough, and this Argosy aircraft played a central role in the dramatic events. The Kaikoura UFOs, as they became known, created a worldwide media frenzy. They also sparked formal government inquiries and intensive scientific investigation in New Zealand and the United States. But they remain a mystery to this day. So join us now aboard the Argosy as we return to the skies above Kaikoura and hear what really happened on that dramatic night from the people who were there. It all started on a warm, clear Marlborough evening just before Christmas 1978, and at Air Force Base Woodburn, Ian Uffendell was doing his routine evening patrol.
Well, I was a warrant officer in the RNZAF based at Woodburn, and the night in question I was the orderly officer for the base. And about 11:30 I went out to do my last rounds, something I was always meticulous in doing. And as I got down to the corner of the tarmac here, I saw what I thought was a Bristol freighter coming in to land direct from the beacon at Cape Campbell. And I stopped to watch it come in, and it never came. So after a few minutes, I decided to go up to the control tower and talk to the duty controller. We went up there and he got the binoculars out and had a look, and he said, "Oh, I think it might be a DC-8 going into Wellington." He said, "You can see its landing light beam." And he gave me the binoculars, and I said to him, "Well, if that's a DC-8, I said, it's just done a split-arse turn in its own length because the landing light's now pointing in the other direction." And he said to me, "Ooh," he said, "perhaps we're getting a visit from the little green men." And we both had a bit of a laugh about that, and he said, I think I'll ring the chaps in Wellington radar and see if they've got anything.
We saw targets on the radar which we could correlate with lights in the sky, but what they were, I've no idea. I wish I did. The radar matched the visual sighting in that case perfectly.
There was 3 lights, a big one in the middle and a small one on either side, and they were equidistant from the big one. They came up and then they did an arc, a perfect arc of a circle, 90 degrees, and they moved off in a westerly direction, and they moved back towards the big light in an easterly direction, slowly, periodically sending out these beams of light. And I couldn't help thinking that this was somebody or something searching for something on the ground or out at sea or wherever they were.
We'd had phone calls, mind you, of people who'd seen strange lights in the Hutt Valley. Blenheim were reporting that people had seen strange lights off Blenheim. We had someone else ring us up and ask us if there was an aircraft flying over here because they could hear this funny whistling noise. And then we were seeing these things on the radar. So there was an awful lot of it of, this is something different, this is unusual, you know, it was this is, hey, what is this?
In the area at the time were 2 Argosy aircraft on their normal night freight runs. The puzzled radar operators called them up and asked them to keep a lookout for any unusual lights. Over the next 2 hours, both Argosies flew along the Kaikoura coast, and both crews were astounded by what they saw.
And then the radar voice came on and said, "Look, we've got something out here that on our screens that we haven't identified. Would you care to help us?"
10 o'clock to you, range 30 miles, is a large target. This one tracked out from Wellington. We saw it first of all 30 miles out from Wellington. It tracked out to 60 miles and remained stationary for about 3/4 of an hour and has now moved about 20 miles to the west.
Then he said, "Well, we've got a large object on your port wing direction. Can you see that?" Well, in the Argosy you can't see out unless you lean forward. So we leaned forward, both Ian and I did, and we saw this large object.
We popped out of this cloud and here was this light, but so close that it was almost frightening. You know, what the hang is that?
Do we have a bright red glowing light out to our 10 o'clock position? Hard to say what range it is, but it's definitely airborne.
I think at the time I described it as being the size of a house burning in the sky, and that's actually what it looked like, you know, like a house fire, that sort of intensity of colour, but a little bit pear-shaped.
Jackpot. The southbound Argosy has seen a big red thing.
My God.
Yes, about 10,000 feet. Yeah, 2,000 feet above him. Yeah, we can see it too on radar.
The big target that we had out to the southeast came across again, turned with the Argosy and tracked and paced him for a good 10 minutes or 20 miles. I'm not sure what the Argosy's cruising speed was, but it was certainly keeping pace level on the Argosy's wingtip.
I must admit the back of my neck went a bit funny. the old hair in the back of my neck a wee bit. I don't know what happened to Lee, and he wouldn't tell me if I asked him, so I didn't ask him.
Yeah, it was a bit of a concern. I mean, it was an enormous thing to look at, and obviously very hot and appearing to be on fire. The last thing you'd want to do is get too close to it.
The atmosphere was so electric that night, it really was.
And that's why the bright red one.
We thought met balloons. We thought weather, but there was no weather because it was a gin clear night. Radar malfunction? No, we didn't think so. Everything else was good. The argosies were where they said they were, so everything seemed to be functioning normally. We just had these strange returns on the radar. There were all sorts of theories came up, but most people were sort of genuinely interested in what we had seen and what happened that night. It was very exciting.
They were looking for something. That's the only explanation for these beams of light that kept coming down. And I know that the next day in the newspaper here, there were reports from people living down the coast who said that there were these lights that came down out of the sky, lighting up the ground and the sea.
Next day, the word spread that something very strange was happening in the skies above Kaikoura. Newspapers, TV and radio reported the story, and it caught the attention of another journalist, Leonard Lee, at Channel O in Melbourne, Australia.
I heard a newscast, the 11 o'clock news, and I heard something that actually caught my attention quite profoundly. And it was the story of an encounter here between two freight airline pilots and some unidentified flying objects in the Kaikoura skies that had been confirmed by government radar. As it turned out, we had another New Zealand reporter in our newsroom. His name was Quentin Fogarty. I contacted Quentin and said, Quentin, are you aware that there's been a big UFO encounter over there? And Quentin said to me on the phone, yes. He said, I am aware of it. And I said, I've got permission for you to go and hire a freelance film crew, if you'll break your holidays for a couple of days, and go and do what we call a recap. So Quentin said, yeah, I'll see what I can do. He rang me a couple of 3-4 days later and said, look, I've got it organised. I've got the same plane, the same route, but different pilots. And he said, we're going to fly on December the 30th. So I said, fantastic. I said, just let me know the freight number of the film and the sound tapes and send them back with a script, record a voiceover, and I'll put it together back here and that'll be fine. Thanks very much.
I thought the job would be interesting. It was a good story. We were following up a strong UFO sighting. I had an interest in that. But I didn't for 1 second even begin to imagine that we would get involved in something ourselves.
I guess I was quite sceptical about the whole thing, but then I got the call from Quentin Fogarty to say, can go and do a job. He'd like to go up on the Argosy the following weekend, do the same route that Vern Powell had done, and so am I interested? And I said, oh yeah, I'll do it.
So Quentin and the film crew prepared to fly a routine Argosy freight trip from Wellington to Christchurch. There would be 5 people on board that night: pilots Bill Startup and Bob Gard, reporter Quentin, cameraman David Crockett, and David's wife Nairi, the sound recordist.
I was a bit apprehensive. When I first got on, it was nothing like I'd ever seen before, and it was absolutely chocker full of newspapers. We had to sort of climb over the newspapers to get to the rear seats to strap in. It just felt like that at any minute it was going to swing away and you'd be gone out, because there were no inside walls, or there was just like a big shell. Yeah, amazing aircraft.
And was actually just doing a stand-up to camera, and only got into the first part of the stand-up to camera, and Captain Bill Startup yelled down, you better get up here because the same thing's happening again.
We're now approaching the Clarence River, where the highest concentration of UFOs was sighted on the morning of December the 21st.
We'd just completed the first take, and I think it was Bill who put his head down the hatch and said, you guys better get up here quickly. So I wanted to get up the stairs, but David wanted to do take 2, and if the cameraman wants take 2, then we do take 2. So we did take 2 and then went up the stairs.
It's a beautiful clear night outside, and naturally we'll be looking out for anything unusual.
Well, David started off on this seat here, and Quentin was to the left of him at that stage, and I was just crouched down on the floor behind the seat. We sort of moved around the whole time as David was filming out of different windows to catch the lights.
Went up, leaned over the co-pilot to try and see this object that the radar station from Wellington was telling us was behind us and then coming up alongside us, and so just pressed the button of the camera and let it run.
The very first thing we saw was these sort of balls of light that would just appear in the sky. And I mean, it was really just looking through small windows at a very, very black sky and seeing pulsating lights. That started usually as a very, very small pinprick of light and then would glow into a great globe of light.
We have a strong target at 12 o'clock to you at 20 miles. Roger, we have that one also, and quite a good visual display at the moment. It's showing light. It looks like a collection of lights. Okay.
It was all right at the beginning. It was quite exciting that suddenly there were lights, but I had never seen anything as bright as that. And they were like bright lights, and then they would just dip away and then come back somewhere else over a little bit further. But they definitely did not look like a reflection of a light. It was like they were too solid or too, and they weren't the same shape, they weren't the same size. You know, there was like one big light and there was like, you know, a couple of smaller lights.
14,000 feet we were up, beautiful clear night, no turbulence whatsoever, zoomed in and out of this object, and I thought it was fairly close to the Argosy because it seemed to be so bright. But when Dr. Bruce Maccabee, the optical physicist from the United States, came down and he did all the analysis of everything, went over the film footage and looked at everything, he said, "Did you know that that object was 5 miles from you and probably as big as a 2-story building?"
The flight continued down the coast, cameraman David doing his best to film the lights from the cramped flight deck and Nairi recording Quentin's commentary.
They're still there. You can see the one to the right of us is still reasonably bright. We can see them, but it's just about impossible to film them, because by the time the cameraman gets his focus, knows exactly where they are, they disappear again.
People have commented on my commentary a few times and said that I sounded, you know, very calm, collected and everything. But people who know me, and I myself know that there was quite a degree of strain in that commentary. To people who don't know me, it may have sounded calm and collected, but to me and to my friends and family, I sounded like I was under some duress.
The atmosphere on board was electric and becoming increasingly tense, especially when Wellington radar reported that one of the objects was now following immediately behind them.
We've just heard from Wellington radar that we've got an object about a mile behind us and it's following us. Let's hope they're friendly.
Sierra Alpha Echo, there's a strong target right in formation with you now. Could either be left or right, but your target is double its size.
So Captain Startup turned the Argosy around in 2 complete circles, trying to see what was going on.
A week or 2 prior to this flight, we had heard about the Valentish incident in Australia, where Valentish was flying from the mainland to Tasmania and radioed back that he was being zapped by bright lights and everything, and then the audio went dead. They've never found him. They've never found any records. They've never found anything. And I think when Captain Bill Startup got the okay to fly off course towards this object, I think the feeling was amongst all of us, are we going to get zapped? You know, is something going to happen? Are we going to be taken away? So there was some anxiety there.
What really got me unnerved because there was something on our tail, they'd picked up something on our tail, that he wanted to do a turn so he could see what was behind him. And when you're crouched down in a plane, taking sound, and this monstrous bird you're in, it turns, right round, and it was, and there seemed like a whole glow in the plane, and I just did not want to touch the sides of the plane. It just seemed as if it would be hot, and I don't expect I've ever told anybody this before, but there was a whole glow in the plane. We could see our way from the upstairs right down to the rear as clear as if it was a daylight. Quentin was already in his seat by the time I got there, and he just grabbed hold of my hands, and he was not very happy about the whole feeling. It was a really scary feeling at that stage.
The mysterious lights continued to follow the plane almost all the way to Christchurch. Everyone was relieved when the Argosy finally landed in the early hours of the morning.
Well, I'd already said there's no way would go back on that plane. But at that stage, that was supposed to be the end of the job anyway. So I was quite happy that we were down on the ground. Oh, yeah. I couldn't wait to get out.
When we climbed off the Argosy, and I mentioned it to Bill Startup, I put my hands down alongside the aircraft to get down, and there seemed to be some sort of electricity on the outside. It was like a magnetism. You know how you can open a wrapping of cellophane or something and it'll stick to your finger? It was the same feeling like that on the outside of the Argosy. And I mentioned it to one or two people. I think Nairi also picked that up. She said, oh, it's something like magnetic.
I wasn't relieved to get on the ground. I was excited to get on the ground. We wanted to talk to the air traffic controllers in Christchurch, to find out what they'd seen. We felt we were caught up in something pretty extraordinary.
We're now in the radar room at Christchurch Airport. It's about 1:45, and in about another 20 minutes we intend to take off again in the Argosy and retrace the route we took only a few moments earlier. We've just heard from Wellington radar that there are still targets in the Kaikoura area. So this time we're hoping to get better film than we did last time, and all I can say is we'll see what happens.
When the opportunity came along to go back on the flight, I thought about it. My wife was at the airport at this point, and in some ways I wanted that sort of reassurance and affection and love, and not to go back on this silly plane back into that dark sky. But at the same time I thought, well, you never know, there might be some more up there, so we went back.
So the Argosy, without Nairi, took off from Christchurch and headed back along the coast toward Blenheim. It didn't take long before they were right in the thick of it again.
They were brilliant white, silvery white starbursts. It was unusual in that they were going vertically up and down, probably 6, 7, maybe even 8,000 feet, at a rate that, in my view, precluded them from being anything that I'd known about, like helicopters or whatever.
I'm now looking over towards the right of the aircraft, and we have an object confirmed by Wellington radar. It's been following us for quite a while. It's about 4 miles away, and it looks like a very faint star, but then it emits a very bright white and green light. I must admit, this is just a little bit frightening.
The objects we saw on the way down were quite amazing, because they were the ones that had the most sort of hypnotic quality. They were big, they pulsated, they were sort of yellow, red and orange, and they formed sort of perfect spheres, so they were pretty spectacular. On the way back, that wasn't as brilliant in terms of the colours. It was more a steady sort of yellow, orange light the whole time. But when we lost that object on the way back, and before we landed at Blenheim, we got the same sort of display again that we'd seen on the way down, which was quite spectacular.
It was an object that I've always described like a squashed orange. It was the colour of an orange, but instead of round, it was more elliptical. to me, this was the most visual and interesting phenomenon I've ever seen.
Well, this is the camera that shot that object way back in 78, 79. It's a very weighty camera, especially with the magazine filled with film. And what I had to do was lean over like this over the co-pilot to try and shoot this object. And then I would be focusing, zooming, and trying to do all that in a very, very small cabin.
Once again, the objects were tracked by Wellington radar and also showed up on the Argosy's own radar system. They fell from view as the aircraft swung around Cape Campbell and turned west for its landing at Blenheim. It was just after 3 a.m, and by that stage, even the pilots had had enough.
Too right, it was, and I decided, home we go. I'm not going any more. Yes, it was a bit frightening in the finish. I don't know, Bob, what it's saying, I don't know. You ask him, I don't know. But I know I was concerned. Down we go, thank you very much.
Next day, the story was big news, and it just kept getting bigger.
I don't think any of us realised what the outcome was going to be of this, of what the publicity was going to be. All hell broke loose, you know. I had phone calls the next day come in from Walter Cronkite in the US wanting us to go up and do some interviews up there.
I got a phone call from the Chief of Staff at Channel O. Neil was babbling on the phone. This is about 8 in the morning or something. He said, Leonard, he said, you know that Quentin Fogarty was going up last night on that flight. He said he went up on the flight and he said, you will not believe this, but he said it happened again and they filmed it. I nearly fell off the telephone.
As the news spread, Argosy Captain Bill Startup and First Officer Bob Guard were flown to Wellington for TV interviews.
Theorise what it was? I can't. It just appeared to be a light. It was unidentified as far as I was concerned.
Bill Startup was doing his professional best to explain.
Could that have been the planet Venus we saw as we came out of Christchurch?
No way. And the planet Venus doesn't sort of pass beneath our aircraft. We weren't that far up in space.
You had it on your own aircraft radar as well, did you not?
That's correct, yes. And it was in a range from 15 to 12 miles time to time.
Can you personally think of any rational, logical explanation for what you saw last night?
No, I can't. I saw it, but I don't know what it is.
Air Force Skyhawks were put on alert, and an Orion surveillance aircraft was dispatched to search the area. Meanwhile, Quentin Fogarty headed back to Melbourne with the precious film in his briefcase.
Somebody picked Quentin up from the airport and brought him back to the channel, and I remember him emerging from the darkness with a can of film. And he said, as he handed it to me, "It's my story, isn't it?" And I said, "Of course it's your story, Quentin." I was very proud of what he had done.
The film initially was extraordinarily disappointing when we watched it. I mean, it only got exciting, and we only started to yell a little bit when we slowed it down and put it in extreme slow motion because there was camera movement. And when we slowed it down, it was exciting.
We looked at that very closely, and it was just rising excitement. And I will never forget the words of Quentin Fogarty after we'd seen a little bit. He was beside himself. We all were, you know. But Quentin suddenly yelled out, "Geronimo! We got the bastards!" So we then knew that we had something. So we put the thing together. We managed to get Quentin cogent enough to sit in the studio and present the piece, and we put it out to air that night.
Good evening. I'm Quentin Fogarty. The film you've just seen was shot from the cabin of an aircraft early Sunday morning local time.
The phones kept going mad. It just about blew our switchboard apart. We rated like we'd never rated before. People were absolutely fascinated by it.
What you have just seen, we believe, is the best documented evidence ever of an unidentified flying object. The encounter is unique because it was seen by 5 people in the cabin of that plane. It was visible on radar in both Wellington and Christchurch. It was also visible on the aircraft's own radar system. Perhaps more importantly, it was finally recorded on television film. It fulfilled all the requirements.
The world had been told about the story. All of a sudden, the insults, the doubters, the skeptics started surfacing. And it wasn't long before we started hearing, oh, it must have been Jupiter, must have been Venus, might have been a meteor. No, it could have been a hoax. A hoax? I couldn't believe it.
I was convinced that what we saw on television was Venus in the morning sky. Venus is very bright. It is frequently mistaken for a UFO, and the colour could be accounted for by the fact that it was so low in the sky, just as the sun and the moon become orange and pink when they are low in the sky.
Venus has never appeared on an air traffic control radar, to the best of my knowledge.
Venus hadn't even risen in the morning sky that time, you know. Captain Bill Startup got the permission to go towards this object. We went off course and went towards it. I was filming and it just disappeared. And as soon as it disappeared, Captain Startup says, oh, it's gone off our screen, and the radar station said, well, it's gone off ours too. Venus must move very quickly.
In my opinion, the UFO seen on that night, which is basically a tornado which can burn a gaseous fuel and give the impression of being a fireball. The ball of flame can move up and down or side to side, can shift around quite dynamically, but seeing that at night would present quite a spectacle.
The lights on a squid boat are very large electric lights. It's a very, very bright light. One of the conclusions was that it may have been due to the presence of squid boats.
The reason we don't think they were squid boats is because the targets were moving at aircraft speeds. They were following the Argosy, matching its speed. Squid boats don't go that fast. No boat, commercial boat, goes that fast.
Oh, squid boats go, what, 380 miles an hour, was it, that the Argosy flew? Oh, gosh, they're wonderful, aren't they? They keep up with an Argosy that's going that fast. And I wasn't pointing down to the ocean. I was pointing the camera level at 14,000 feet. That this object was following us.
I think in many ways the straight reporting of the story initially was fine. It was just after that when you start then bringing in so-called experts and things, and then you bring in people who got airplay, who suggested we had hoaxed it. You know, that when it started to get to that very personal stage where people started to really question your integrity, that hurt.
What it was years ago, we don't know. And that's all it can be. I wish I knew. Well, people can think about that, but they were not on the aircraft.
Dr. Bruce Maccabee did a very good report on it. He studied it for a long, long time, and I think the report was very good. There was some question about the loop that this object did, whether it was camera shutter problem. I checked the camera again after that and it didn't seem to do that, so maybe the object did do that. It was so quick that I wouldn't have noticed it. The only time I would have picked it up was watching the film, you know.
I mean, I did the interview for TV3 in New Zealand just recently, and, you know, TV3, the producer called me and said, I'm getting these calls from people who say that, you know, this never happened, that it was a squid fishing boat. And I'm thinking, didn't we put that to bed 30 years ago?
There had been a sighting by a gentleman down at Waikawa a couple of nights before, and an object rose up from down in the Marlborough Sounds and wobbled its way over Warramunga Bay and over Port Underwood and disappeared. And I believe that that was a UFO and that it crashed, and what we saw was the search and rescue team looking for it.
As I said in the start, I was a skeptic to all this, but I'm not now. There's something going on out there, and it was captured on film. It was seen by all the people in the aircraft. It was seen by people on the ground. It was captured on 2 radar stations, both in Wellington and Christchurch. So are we being watched like we're watching, sending probes to Mars and beyond, right out of our galaxy? Perhaps somebody's doing the same to us.
They were the brightest lights I had ever seen. I have no idea what they were, but they were definitely, well, it was unidentified. They were flying because they were moving so quickly, and it obviously was an object because it was showing up on both radars. So if that is what a UFO is, that's what it was that night. An unidentified flying object. And there were several of them. And it was scary.
At some time in the future, we may find out exactly what those objects were that flew with the Argosy in the skies above Kaikoura. More likely it will remain a mystery forever. And for the people involved, it will always be a unique and life-changing experience that they will never forget.
I'm glad I wasn't on that aeroplane, because I don't think I would have survived it psychologically. Now, Quentin Fogarty was on that aeroplane. He's a very good journalist. I saw Quentin collapse on my floor in my office some 4 days later from the pressure that this thing had created, the impact. It's almost like being, zapped with a stun gun. I saw him actually fall off his chair and fall on the floor and curl into a fetal position.
I mean, the only real effect on me, was the fact that I got what's described as nervous exhaustion and ended up in hospital, right? So I was, for a couple of weeks, I was just out of it because I hadn't slept and there was all the pressure, there was all the stuff going on. So it had a dramatic effect on me in a physical and a mental sense, but just in the aftermath of what happened. After that, no.
It had all sorts of effects on everybody. I just couldn't sleep for many nights, It was because it started to be such a big story, and I decided that I would make a documentary about it, and so that's what I did. And that documentary really took me around part of the world doing lectures and things like that. It was a big change in my life and the life of my family,
Everything sort of went wrong for us. David went on an overseas trip to sell the documentary. He went to Australia and then he went to America, where he was invited to a big UFO conference there, and then he went on to England and he never came home. So the UFOs did a lot, didn't do me any favours. I'd never do it again.
Everybody thinks that we've made a lot of money out of this UFO thing. The only people who've made any money are the big networks. It was sold to CBS or something, I think. Was that the one that Cronkite belonged to? It was sold to them for I don't know how much money, but probably $200,000 or $300,000 or more, I didn't see any of that. And nobody in our aircraft Argosy that was concerned with that plane made any money out of this. So I want everybody to know we didn't make any money.
I have very strong spiritual beliefs. I believe in God and all of that sort of stuff. And to me, this could have been quite possible, that they came from another dimension. They may have been coming here to take over the earth, And in that case, then we should align ourselves with a force that could resist that, a force for good.
If you would like to know more about the Kaikoura UFO mystery, Captain Startup's fascinating book, The Kaikoura UFOs, is available in the terminal. For the full Safe Air and Argosy story, The award-winning television documentary The Final Flight is also available on DVD.